The letter arrived on a Tuesday. That detail matters because my father was a man of routines, and Tuesdays were the day he paid his bills, balanced his checkbook, and left a voicemail for me that always started the same way. Nothing urgent. Just checking. He had been dead for 9 days when the letter came. It wasn't from an attorney. It wasn't from a bank. The return address was a street I didn't recognize in Dublin, Ireland, and the handwriting on the envelope was not my father's. Someone else had addressed it, but when I opened it, the single card inside had 4 words written in his hand. Block letters, no punctuation, the way he wrote everything. Find Margaret Holt, Dublin. My father was a retired CIA analyst, not the kind you see in movies. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru, grew tomatoes in the backyard, and spent his retirement years volunteering at the public library in Charlottesville, Virginia, shelving books on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He never carried a weapon that I knew of. He never talked about his work. Not once, not even when I was old enough to understand why he couldn't. He simply didn't. That was the boundary, and we never crossed it. He died on a Sunday morning in October. Cardiac arrest. He was 67 years old. He was alone in the house, which was the way he preferred most things. My younger sister Claire called me before the hospital did. A neighbor had found him. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. I drove 4 hours from Richmond without stopping. By the time I arrived, Claire had already started making lists. She had always been like that, practical in a way that looked cold to people who didn't know her. Lists of who to call, what to cancel, what to keep. She had her notebook open on his kitchen table before his coffee maker had even finished the cycle he'd set the night before. I didn't say anything about the notebook. I just stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen and thought about how completely ordinary it was. Dish towel folded over the oven handle. Newspaper folded to the crossword, half finished. A mug that said Charlottesville Public Library sitting clean in the rack. He hadn't left much. The house, which was modest, a small savings account, a life insurance policy that barely covered the funeral, and the contents of a 2-bedroom home that smelled like old books and Irish Spring soap. Claire found the will filed properly with a local attorney. Everything was split evenly between the two of us. No surprises, no complications. That was what we thought. The letter arrived while Claire was at the attorney's office sorting paperwork. I was alone in the house, standing at the kitchen counter when I opened it. Find Margaret Holt, Dublin. I read it 3 times. I turned the card over. Nothing on the back. No explanation. No context. The envelope had a Dublin postmark dated 5 days before my father died. Someone had mailed this knowing he wouldn't be the one to receive it. I put the card in my jacket pocket and didn't mention it to Claire. That evening, after she went back to her hotel, I went through the house the way I hadn't let myself do yet. Slowly, opening drawers I had never opened, running my hands along the back of closet shelves. His home office was the last room I entered. It was tidy. His desk held a lamp, a notepad, a cup of pens, and a framed photograph of the 2 of us from a hiking trip in Shenandoah when I was maybe 14. He was squinting into the sun and I was laughing at something just off camera. I couldn't remember what. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a folder of old utility receipts, I found a small green notebook, the kind with elastic band closure. I opened it carefully. Most of the pages were blank, but near the front, in the same block handwriting, there were names and dates. Cities I recognized: Geneva, London, Dublin, Singapore. Dates going back almost 15 years. I had never known my father to travel internationally. Not once in my adult life had he mentioned a passport or a flight abroad. I closed the notebook and slid it into my bag. That night, I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, in the room he'd kept exactly as I left it when I went to college, and stared at the ceiling and tried to think clearly. My father had been a man of absolute routine. Coffee at 6, library on Tuesdays and Thursdays, dinner at 7, church on Sundays. He had not been living a double life in the way people mean when they say that. He had not been dramatic about anything, but the dates in that notebook were real. The stamps I found later in his passport, tucked inside a worn copy of the complete Sherlock Holmes on his bookshelf, were real. 14 years of quiet travel to cities he had never mentioned, not once, Not to me, not to Claire, not apparently to anyone. Claire called the next morning. She asked if I had found anything else in the house that she needed to know about for the estate. Nothing unusual, I told her. That part wasn't entirely true, but I needed time to understand what I was looking at before I said anything out loud. I had learned that much from my father, at least. Don't speak before you know what you're saying. I called in sick to work that Monday. I sat at his desk and opened my laptop and searched for Margaret Holt in Dublin, Ireland. There were several, but one of them ran a small private foundation on the south side of the city. The website was plain, almost deliberately understated. No photographs, no mission statement that explained anything. Just a name, the Holt Foundation, a phone number, and 2 words under the contact information: by appointment. I stared at that phone number for a long time. I thought about calling Claire first. I thought about calling the attorney. I thought about putting the card back in the envelope and telling myself it wasn't my responsibility to chase a dead man's handwriting across the Atlantic. But I'd stood in his kitchen and looked at his half-finished crossword, and I knew the way I know very few things with certainty. He had left this for a reason, and the reason was meant for me. I dialed the number. A woman answered on the second ring. Her voice was measured, accented in a way I couldn't immediately place, not quite Irish, something flatter beneath it. I told her my name. I told her my father's name. There was a pause. "We've been expecting someone," she said. "We weren't sure who." My throat tightened. "Me," I said. "I think it was supposed to be me." She asked when I could come. I told her I needed 2 weeks to handle the estate. She said that was perfectly fine. She gave me an address and told me to bring identification and any documentation that confirmed my relationship to my father. She didn't tell me what I would find there. She didn't use the word money once. I booked the flight that afternoon. I didn't tell Claire. She called that same evening, the way she had been calling every day since the funeral, working through her lists out loud like I was a sounding board. She wanted to know about the house, whether to list it now or wait until spring, whether to hire a company to clear the furniture or do it ourselves. "There's no rush," I told her. She paused. "There's always a rush," she said. "The longer we hold on to property we're not using, the more we pay in taxes and upkeep." That was Claire, not cruel. Just efficient in the way that sometimes felt like it didn't leave room for grief. "He left enough for both of us," I said carefully. "We have time." She exhaled. "I'm not trying to be heartless. I just know how these things drag on." "I know," I said. "I'll be in touch next week." I didn't tell her about Dublin. The flight from Dulles took 7 hours. I sat in the middle seat and didn't sleep. I looked at the notebook in my lap and read the names and dates again, slow and careful. Some of the names recurred. Margaret Holt appeared 3 times. There was a name beside hers once, R. Calloway. An amount was written next to it that I didn't understand yet. When I landed in Dublin, the sky was the color of old pewter. Low clouds, damp air, the kind of cold that settles into your coat rather than staying on the surface. I took a cab from the airport to a hotel in the city center and spent the first evening walking along the river, letting myself feel the strangeness of being somewhere my father had stood without my knowing. The foundation's address was in Renielig, a quiet residential neighborhood south of the canal. The building was a converted Victorian townhouse painted a deep charcoal gray, with a small brass plaque by the door. No name, just an address number. I rang the bell at exactly 10 in the morning. Margaret Holt answered the door herself. She was in her mid-60s, I guessed. Silver hair cut short, clear eyes. She shook my hand with both of hers and held it for a moment before she let go. "You look like him," she said, around the eyes. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. She led me through a narrow hallway into a sitting room at the back of the house that looked out over a small garden. A tea tray was already on the table. She poured without asking if I wanted any, which I found oddly comforting. "Your father was a careful man," she said, sitting across from me. "He didn't trust easily. When he did, it was permanent." "How did you know him?" I asked. She set down her cup. "He never told you." It wasn't a question. I shook my head. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already expected. He wouldn't have. That was his way. She folded her hands in her lap. He reached out to me 18 years ago, through a contact we shared, a former colleague. He had become aware of something during his career that he couldn't act on officially. A gap, he called it. People who fell through it. I waited. Service members, she said, and the families of intelligence personnel. People who'd given significant portions of their lives to work that was never acknowledged, who had needs, medical, financial, educational, that the government recognized just enough to create bureaucratic processes for, but not enough to actually meet. She said this without bitterness, simply as fact. He started contributing to what eventually became this foundation. Quietly, regularly, for nearly 15 years. He structured it so that neither of us could withdraw funds easily for personal use. Built-in accountability. That was important to him. I set down my cup. How much? I asked. The same question, the same instinct. I heard Claire's voice in my own. Margaret opened a folder on the table and turned it toward me. The number was not what I expected. It wasn't a fortune by the standards of the people who make the news. But it was substantial. Enough to represent 15 years of disciplined, consistent giving from a man who drove an old Subaru and grew tomatoes in shelved library books on Tuesday mornings. Enough to make me realize I had not known him the way I thought I did. I sat with the number for a long moment. He lived like he had nothing, I said. He lived like the money wasn't his, Margaret said carefully. There's a difference. She slid another envelope toward me across the table. My name was written on the front in his handwriting. He left this with me 2 years ago, she said. He updated it once, about 8 months before he died. He said to give it only to whoever came. I picked it up. My hands were steady, which surprised me. Before I opened it, my phone buzzed in my bag. I already knew who it was. Claire. I let it ring. Then I opened the envelope. His handwriting was the same as it always was. Block letters, straight lines. He never wrote with any style, just clarity. The first line was short. If you're reading this, you figured it out. I knew you would. I had to stop for a moment after that. He wrote that he had not told me during his lifetime because he had seen too many times what happened when people knew money was coming. Not because he thought I was greedy. He was specific about that. He wrote, "Not you, never you, but knowledge changes how a room feels." I didn't want that between us. He wrote about the people the foundation had helped. A daughter of a former colleague who had needed surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. A family in Northern Virginia whose father had died of an illness connected to a deployment the government had never classified. 3 children who had gone to college because of a scholarship fund he had helped Margaret structure in 2014. He wrote, "You don't do this for recognition. You do it because you can, and because you know what it cost the people who couldn't." At the end, there was a single practical paragraph. He had named me as a successor trustee. The decision about how to continue, restructure, or in a specific set of circumstances, close the foundation was mine. Margaret would stay on in an advisory capacity as long as she was willing. There were legal documents already prepared with an attorney in Dublin and a corresponding firm in Virginia. He had thought of everything. He always thought of everything. I folded the letter carefully, the way I had watched him fold newspaper, precise along the existing crease. "I have a sister," I said. Margaret nodded. "I know. He mentioned her? And?" She was measured in her answer. He loved her. He also understood her. Those are not always the same thing. I drove back to the hotel in a cab that smelled like pine air freshener and old leather, and didn't speak the whole way. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the folder of documents in my lap and called Claire. She answered before the second ring. "Where have you been? I've called you 3 times. "I'm in Dublin," I said. Silence. "What?" "I'm in Ireland. I found something in Dad's house. I needed to understand it before I said anything to you." The silence stretched longer this time. "Then, what did you find?" I told her, carefully, the way you approach something you know will break differently depending on where the pressure lands. I told her about the letter, the notebook. The foundation, Margaret, the documents. When I said the number, she didn't speak for a long time. And he just never said anything. Her voice had gone flat. That was how I knew she was hurt. Claire went flat when she was hurt. She went efficient. He kept it separate, I said. He wrote that he didn't want it to change how things felt between us. It changes everything now. I know. And you're the trustee. Yes. Another silence. Then, so what does that mean for me? I chose my words carefully. It means the foundation continues. The money isn't sitting in an account waiting to be divided. It's structured. There are people who depend on it. There are also 2 daughters, she said, who just buried their father. I understand that. Do you? Her voice wasn't loud. It was careful in a way that felt worse than shouting. You went to Dublin without telling me. You opened his letter. You sat with this woman for however long and made decisions about what this meant before I knew any of it existed. You're right, I said. That part was wrong. She breathed. What was in the letter? The one he wrote to you. I told her. I read her most of it, not all of it, but the parts that mattered, including the line about knowledge changing how a room feels. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he always explained things to you. What do you mean? He had conversations with you that he never had with me. Even when we were kids, you'd sit at the kitchen table after dinner and he'd talk to you about things. Books, history, whatever. And I'd be doing dishes and I always thought it was because you were older. She paused, but maybe it was something else. I didn't answer right away because I didn't have an answer that would be honest and also kind. She wasn't wrong. There had always been a particular frequency between my father and me that Claire had not been on, and I had never thought to examine it carefully when he was alive, and now it was too late to ask him why. I said, he loved you. He told me once, when you were going through your divorce, that you were the stronger one, that you didn't need him to explain things. You just did them. She laughed once, short. That sounds like him making his preferences sound like compliments. Maybe. She didn't say anything for a while. I could hear her breathing. I'm not going to pretend I'm not angry, she said finally. I am. I don't know at who exactly. Maybe at him. Maybe at you. Maybe just at the situation. That's fair, but I'm not going to do something stupid because I'm angry. Another pause. I want to see the documents. I'll send everything when I'm back. She hung up without saying goodbye. With Claire, that wasn't hostility. That was just the end of the information she needed. I had learned that years ago. I spent one more day in Dublin. Margaret walked me through the Foundation's operations, the annual disbursement cycle, the application process families went through, the review board that included a former Army physician and a retired federal judge. It was not flashy. It was not a charity gala operation. It was a process, methodical and quiet, the way my father had built everything. She showed me a summary of the families assisted over the years, analyzed like a medical file. I read through them slowly. A child with a rare neurological condition whose father had died before the diagnosis, a widow in Tennessee who had kept her house because of a single disbursement in 2019, a young man who had finished his engineering degree. My father had never mentioned any of them. Not a word, not even a hint. You don't advertise help. You just provide it. He hadn't written that in his letter, but I heard him say it as clearly as if he'd been sitting across from me at his kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with his coffee going cold, while he talked about something that would stay with me for years without my knowing it at the time. When I flew home, Claire was waiting in my father's house. Not in an ambush way, just the way she waited, sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook open. She had driven from her apartment in Roanoke. She looked up when I came in. She didn't hug me. That wasn't unusual. I put the folder on the table and sat down across from her the way I'd sat across from the banker in Dublin, and I walked her through everything at the same careful pace. The timeline. The structure. What could and couldn't be dissolved. What Margaret had explained. What the legal framework looked like. She listened without interrupting, which was the most serious thing Claire could do. When I finished, she looked at the table for a moment. There's a family provision, she said. It wasn't a question. She had read the summary I sent. Yes. Not a lump sum. Structured. Financial oversight. Yes. She looked up. I'm not a financial disaster. I know that. I went through a rough patch. The divorce wasn't cheap and the timing was bad. I know. Her jaw shifted slightly. I just want to feel like he thought of me. He did, I said. The provision is in the documents. He thought of you by name. That landed differently than I expected. Her expression shifted in a way I hadn't seen in years. Just for a moment, the efficiency dropped, and underneath it was something much younger. The girl who did dishes while our father and I talked at the kitchen table, who had always done things instead of asking and had maybe wondered her whole life if doing was enough. He could have just told us, she said quietly. I know. It would have been easier. Maybe. But he didn't think it would be better. She looked at the folder for a long moment. Then she reached out and turned it toward her and started reading. We stayed at that table for 3 hours, going through documents, asking questions, occasionally disagreeing about what a clause meant or what the right next step was. At some point, I made coffee without either of us acknowledging the shift in the room, and she accepted a cup without comment. We didn't resolve everything that evening. There were things between us, the years of parallel lives, the different relationships with our father, the phone call from Dublin that weren't going to be settled by paperwork. But when she finally picked up her keys to leave, she stopped at the door. I'm still angry, she said. I know, but I'm not going to fight you. She looked at the hallway closet where his coat still hung. He built something that's worth more than what I was imagining. What were you imagining? I asked. She gave a small, tired smile. I don't know, something simpler. She opened the door. Call me before you make any decisions. I will. She left. I stood in the kitchen for a while after her headlights faded down the street, and then I washed both cups and put them back in the rack where I'd found them. Over the next 8 months, the foundation continued exactly as it had been structured. Disbursements went out on schedule. Margaret and I spoke by phone twice a month. I hired a Virginia attorney who had worked in international estate law, and she confirmed what the Dublin firm had said. The structure was solid, legally unassailable, built to last past both of us. Claire came to visit in the spring, not for business, just to visit. We walked through the garden where the tomato plants had been, bare now since I hadn't replanted them. She said she didn't know he gardened. Every summer, I told her. You just weren't here for summers much. She looked at the garden for a moment. I kept waiting for him to ask me to come more. He wasn't going to ask. I know that now. We had lunch at a diner near the house where he used to take me on Saturday mornings when I was a kid. She had never been. That surprised me more than anything else. 17 years of Saturday mornings, and he'd never brought her once. And I had never once noticed her absence. I didn't know how to explain that. I wasn't sure I could, but we sat in the same booth and she ordered the same thing I always ordered, and by the end of it, something had shifted that I couldn't fully name. Not fixed. Shifted. A year after my father died, I drove back to Charlottesville on a clear afternoon in October and walked into the public library on Jefferson Street. I told the woman at the desk that my father had volunteered there. She remembered him immediately. Gerald, she said, Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Always early. He'd have the cart half done before I even got my coat off. I laughed. That sounded right. Is he doing okay? I told her gently. She sat down. She put her hand over her mouth. She said he had been coming for almost 9 years and she didn't know he had family. That hit harder than I expected. He didn't advertise, I said. She nodded slowly. He shelved fiction alphabetically and then he put one face out on the end of each row, something he thought people should find. I always meant to ask him how he chose them. I thought about the copy of Sherlock Holmes where I'd found his passport, about the card that said "Find Margaret Holt," about the notebook with 15 years of careful entries. He chose carefully, I said. I drove home along the back roads, the way he used to, through the part of Virginia where the trees come right down to the edge of the pavement and the light goes amber in October like it's deliberate. I thought about what it cost to be that quiet for that long, to hold something significant and never once let it become the thing that defined you in a room. Some people build loudly. They need the recognition because without it, the thing doesn't feel real. My father didn't need it to feel real. He just needed it to be real. I had not inherited money. I had inherited a standard. That distinction had taken me almost a year to fully understand, and I still wasn't sure I was living up to it. But I was steady. That was the word I kept coming back to. He had written one line in that notebook, not directions, not an explanation, just a line at the very front of the first page, easy to miss if you were looking for something more important. Steady is enough. He was right. He was almost always right about the things that mattered. I just hadn't known to listen for them while he was still here to say them. If there is someone in your life who lives quietly, not because they have nothing, but because they've decided that what they're building doesn't need an audience, pay attention to them. Ask questions while there are still answers, because the things left behind in shoeboxes and green notebooks and Dublin offices aren't secrets kept from you, they're invitations. You just have to find them.